Hi, this is Dr. Scott Young, and today we're going to do the Tribulation series. This is the sixth one, and it's on the sheep nations who go into the millennial reign. Coming right up. Okay, so let's bring that puppy up and we will walk through it together with that. Okay, I have some really interesting notes, but I do want to share with. Oh, sorry. Let me do one thing. I do want to share with you a couple books that are helpful in this particular topic. One is called "The Wedding of Jesus," and this does talk about the bride or the faithful. You're the faithful. It talks also about the sheep and a little bit about the goats. So that's a helpful one to look at. Um, there is also the Foretold Book 1 and 2. You can get them. They're $17 each. Every other book I have is $10 each. The Foretold 1 and 2 is Dr. Jeff and I who have did this book. And when you order it, you got kind of going directly to him, through him on that kind of thing. So that gives you a little bit of background. So Foretold Book 1 and 2, and the Wedding of Jesus with that too. So that'll help you with some background knowledge with that too. And by the way, if you want to have a little bit more information, one of the cool downloads that we have is on the website is you can download a digital version of the Tribulation series, and it's a timeline. So that is also a very helpful kind of tool as you're looking through some of this stuff. Okay, so let's bring it back up on the stage, and we have the sheep. Okay, so let's go through a little bit more about the sheep. Now, I like doing this. I think you guys like this a little bit too, but we're going to focus more on the last 3.5 years in this way. So the last 3.5 years of that timeline, again, we have the middle part of the tribulation. We have Rosh Hashanah, which is Jesus showing up in the clouds. Philippians 4:11, I think it is. And then we have Yom Kippur with that too. So the second seal, now the first seal is the Antichrist, okay? The second seal is going to come a little bit later into the first half of the tribulation with that too. And that would be what we call World War III. Now, some people disagree with me and they think, oh, we're already in World War III. And I'm like, no, not in my kind of viewpoint in this way. The reason why I would say that is that this one here is going to start a tetrarchal nature of three different seals. And in those three seals, 1.875 estimate of 1.875 billion people are going to die in that short amount of period of time. And we're talking about maybe 6 months to a year. I mean, so it sounds kind of nuclear to me in that way with that, which is another reason why the Bible is so true. I mean, even if you place any one of these wars inside of 25% of the planet in a 7 year period of time, would never have occurred in the history of the world. Guys, catch that. The history of the world, no one could ever see a quarter of the planet, and then there's later on. I'm going to show you how a third of the planet, the next third of the planet dies as well. So we have, the hyperinflation, the famine, the pale horse of death, and that's the quarter. So these are a tetrarch nature with it too. And then the fifth seal is the martyrs, or the martyrs, excuse me, are the martyrs. And the martyrs are those of the called. That's the last half of group of people who come to Christ with that. We also have the first trumpet, which is the hail and fire that which burn up a third of the planet with that. In the same basic time frame, just a little bit later, we have a tsunami, a comet that jumps down, hits into, I would say, into the ocean on this one. It could also hit land, so I would say more likely ocean on this particular one. There is another meteor that hits down and hits into a third of the waters of fresh waters and makes it bitter. And that's, I mean, think about how much death and destruction could be in here, which are partly related to the second, third, and fourth seals. Very easily could be, right? We have what I call hell on earth. It is flipping inside of hell and dropping it on the planet. We've never seen that before. Now, the seven bowls will show up in that last maybe 30-ish days, maybe a little earlier, later than that, but basically in that kind of time frame. Okay, so let's talk more about the conditions. We talked about this one and the one on the called. The last 3.5 years, some of the conditions, the mark of the beast is required. Now, it would be a voluntary issue in the maybe early part, required in the second half. And remember, we talked a little bit about this as a mandate. Mandate puts you under the authority of the beast. And so that's a real powerful kind of nature. When you follow under a mandate of any type of any type of position a government takes, it means that you they expect you to follow along with their things, but you don't have to. But here's what happens: you might be in violation of their codes. Laws actually are written in and have a little bit more teeth. I'm not so sure how I would actually place the mark of the beast, whether they would create it as a law or they would create it as a mandate. But even if it was a law, Romans 13 tells us that any law that violates the law of God, we don't follow. So that would be something that's really a powerful area. Now, we also have a continual grieving that we talked about. So many people are dying over and over again, and you will be, those people at that time frame will just trying to be surviving, and they'll have to move on from their dead. This is very common in war with that too. So we're going to see that massive grieving. There's not going to be a lot of happy times here with that. It's going to be as chaotic as any apocalyptic movie out there. If you think about the nature of, the Walking Dead series or any other series you want to talk, Mad Max kind of things, the chaotic nature of that would actually show up in the ways that people would do the crimes. And I do kind of like some of the apocalyptic or post-apocalyptic movies, not because of how they present it like everything's all destroyed, but more in how they break down some of the psychology of the characters with it too in there. I mean, people who are insurance salesmen become, the worst of the worst of these generals kind of thing. And which will lead to anarchy. Basically, governmental systems will have fully fallen off the map in many areas with that too. And then again, we talk about this in Matthew 24, but it's this pregnancy cycle. In the first part of a trimester, there's some changes. Second part, many more changes. Third part, massive changes. And yet it uses that analogy or that metaphor to explain what it's going to be like in the tribulation. Okay? Now, lastly, I want you to know some of the plagues, but we'll just say it, and we sort of, gave it to you. But I want you to have the backdrop of this. And this is why I had lots and lots of troubles with this character, okay? And I'm gonna pull this off the screen here in a second, but I want you to think bloody seas, rivers of blood, killing heat, darkness and pain. These are mostly some of the things that happen in the bowls, okay? And by the way, those who are the sheep would live through the bowls, okay? Crops are burned and demons on the loose. Now, that backdrop is what I want to show you over here. And I just want you to read. It took me forever to find this. Now, every single book I write, I will pull up a pad. And so I'll go to conferences and I never write on them, or I steal like an extra pad. I'm like, oh, grab that one. Because I'll use them to write books with. And so one of the things that I always do, whether it's a fiction or a nonfiction book, is write up, the basic process, right? But on fiction, what I first do is kind of get the plot. So I have a basic idea of the plot. And then I'm going to work on the characters. So I have each of the characters named. And by the way, sometimes I suck at names, and so I always have to have someone else help me out with this too. And and then I want to do a real character analysis of each person that are really the primary ones. Now there are always secondary characters or tertiary characters that kind of come in, and you need to have a little understanding who they are, but on a more basic level. Your main characters you really want to know, because when you throw them into the plot, you find unique things that can happen to them. And I just want to share with you. And by the way, this isn't the finished product, because in the finished product you'll hear something different. But these are original notes, and this would be back in late 2013, early 2014 ish. So my character of the nations, or the sheep, is called Nathan, and this is in the Foretold book 1 and 2. I say he's very educated, survives in Montana. Later on, I changed it to Colorado. Doesn't believe in the rapture for a few weeks after the rapture, and thinks that his wife has left him. He's an architect. He designs regular homes for builders in the Denver area. So that's where I start changing it in there. Meets a guy who is a prepper. A prepper likes to design the house, invites him over to show him his prepping activities. Again, I adjust that a little bit too. Nathan meets a prepper, that prepper at Lowe's, and he's not thrilled, doesn't treat him right. The prepper gives him a contact with a very rich prepper. And then Nathan works, for that prepper as an architect, has a privacy agreement not to tell where these things are. And he's working on underground shelters, complex systems that he works for, and I call them Usher, or Underground Shelter Environment Resources. And I had no idea at the time there were these things called DUMBs, Deep Underground Military Bases. And I had never researched this. So it's kind of interesting that I had that, that viewpoint with that. He uses a very creative use of space. He's got great techniques for the space under the stairs. Doesn't believe in their causes either. Okay. He builds drawers under the stairs for his wife, and wants to, without any wasted space. Salvation experience at 12 years old. Then I kind of said, I changed my mind on that one too. He's a good listener, which makes him seem like a deep character, but doesn't enter into life in many ways. So he's a very quiet man, and that was powerful. He listens to people, but maybe he's only hearing and not really listening with that too. Has a son when he was, much younger, and got married. And then, so anyway, those are just some of, and his wife is one of the faithful, or the bride of Christ. And his son, Samuel, actually, I changed that. His wife is one of the chosen. So she survives through the beginning part of the tribulation, as rapture in the middle. His son Samuel becomes one of the bride of Christ. So I'm trying to differentiate those kinds of things for you. So just so you can kind of hear some of the thought process. And I will tell you, this character of Nathan in the sheep was one of the most difficult characters I ever came up with, because I really struggled with that. Now, I'm going to separate a little bit about the sheep and goats. Now, most people have never really interacted with a sheep or a goat. I'm talking about the physical character, the physical animals, okay? Jesus doesn't make a mistake when he uses this. Now, of course, he doesn't make mistakes, but there's a reason why Jesus uses these. And I mentioned to you before, if you've listened through the series, that most pastors and teachers, when they're going to college nowadays, they've never been around a ranch or a farm. So they really don't have any any inference to be able to draw on this stuff. And I spent time when I was as a kid. I lived on 5 acres, but I had always had two pigs in well, about 3 years in 4-H, and so I was around horses. I was around a donkey. Chickens, rabbits, dogs, cats, right? Everything else with that too. And every time I went to the fair, I was around the sheep and goats. So that's why I have a little different perspective on it. And God was setting me up in many ways with that too. So the sheep and are not the smartest animal, but they definitely have an ability to hear the call of their master. Now, I had a kid who, Caleb, but this is a real great kid. I love him. But when he was a freshman, or freshman or sophomore, and he's kind of adjusted his viewpoint. Very interesting personality with this too. And he was a theology major, and I think he got his undergrad degree in theology. And he came back to me one time. And he was like, "I saw something that shows that there are a smart animal." I'm like, "You haven't been around him, bud. I'm sorry, you haven't been around him." And the reality is, when you're around the sheep, they're not a smart animal of animal kingdom with it too. Okay, but they definitely have an ability to hear. When I used to try to take my pigs out in 4-H at the fair, I was like hell to get them outside of the track and just to get them to wash. Right? It was a good thing. It was a fun thing. And as they would come back in, but they just want to wander. I mean, pigs want to do their own thing because they're way smarter animals with this too. But the Bible doesn't use the pig in this one because it could have with that. But one of the things that we find is that with the sheep, all the girls used to do. I never saw a boy with sheep. That's just me. But all the girls that I saw doing the sheep, they would just walk out of the cage, open the door, and then they would call for them, and the sheep would go, right? And they just shoot toward their master with it too. They require security because they're not a brave animal. And there is an interesting truther, and I'm sort of blanking his name out. Oh, Lance Wallnau. Lance Wallnau was talking one time with another group of people, and I might remember. Oh, Andrew Womack. And he was talking at a conference. It was a business conference. So Lance is talking, and he's talking about the sheep and goats in a little bit in that kind of way. And well, Lance admits, he goes, I haven't been around sheep that much, little. And he had made an analogy error. And so this woman walks up to Lance and says, "Hey, listen, I think you got the sheep a little bit wrong. So let me tell you a little story about that." So this is from Lance Wallnau, and he basically said, this woman said, "Hey, listen, when I see the sheep and goats, what will happen is the sheep are looking around at the food, and so are the goats, right? But the goats will kind of go up on a little rise. If there's an area of pasture land, there's always, valleys and little rises just in the way the dirt is kicked up. And so the goats will edge their way. They will knock the sheep out of the way, stand up on this area, and then shoot toward the food and basically bowl over the sheep." It's a real interesting kind of statement. And because I have not seen sheep and goats in the same pen, which you definitely can put them in the same pen, but they're going to eat everything in sight. And so it's interesting in that way. But I did remember how many times the sheep were not very brave. And it will make more sense when we talk about this later. Another point that we have about them, is the church is not the sheep. Do we act like sheep? And do we begin as sheep? Yes. When we come to salvation, and I'm going to show you a chart a little bit later on that will get into this. But so many people struggle with this. Now, I was at a church years ago, and there was a guy named Tony, and that church had been through a very difficult situation with their old pastor, Sorry, I'm just bringing up the word here so I have it ready. And with their old pastor, and what happened is that he got into an inappropriate relationship with someone on staff or in staff or in the church, and it just almost ripped the church apart. And Tony's statement, he goes, and he really liked this new pastor whose name is Scott. I kind of remembered. And he goes, I like Pastor Scott because he smells like the sheep. It was an interesting analogy because he was like, I want a shepherd who smells and interacts with the sheep. And I never forgot that. Now, this guy was a wonderful man. If you met him, you'd love Tony. And Scott was great too. Great teacher with us too. But the point was, is I'm like, yeah, but you don't understand what the sheep are. We are not the sheep. No, there are people in the church that are sheep, but that's not what we're supposed to be. Now, let's flip over to the goats so that you see the differences. The goats are a devious animal. They have a bad mood on most ends. Now, you will see sheep, or excuse me, little tiny goats, and you see little kids. I mean, they're bouncy and fun and everything else. But when you get an adult goat, and we're gonna explain the goats in the next episode. But when you have an adult goat, they're not a real kind animal in every way. They will eat anything. And in that same 4-H, situation, I remember having in my back pocket, I would always have like a rag, because especially as you get near the end, I would have to oil down my pigs. Now, if they're white, I would put baby powder on them to make them look good. But if they were any other color, any darker color, I would put baby oil on them to make them glisten. It was just the thing that you did. And you always had a cane, and that's how you would poke and move them around my pigs. So I had a cane, and I had this oil rag in my back pocket. I remember my jeans pocket. And so this is like the later 80s or 70s, excuse me, when this is happening. And I'm leaning back against this fence. It's just the little diamond fence rings, and like something's tugging on me, and I didn't notice it first, and then I finally turned around, and the goat is eating this oil rag, and I'm like, and so I'd asked, I mean, I couldn't get it away from the goat, or you'd bite my finger off. And so I was like, and I was talking to the kids who had goats, and they go, yeah, they'll eat anything. I mean, they eat plastic, they will eat metal, they'll eat aluminum. If you have, you actually don't want to turn a goat on a pasture land because they will wipe it clean. And sheep sometimes will eat very close down to the stub, whereas a horse or even a donkey won't do that. They'll graze, and they'll kind of keep the grass down. But the sheep and goats will eat it down to the nub, where the goats even go farther and eat anything. Now, we'll talk about that one in the next one. It's just so powerful when you see it. Again, God chose this particular animal that is moving away from the vision of Jesus. Again, we will get into that later, but this is a powerful vision with this too. Now, I do talk about this later, but we'll hit it just a little bit now. The group of the goats are teachers and evangelists that walk away from the Lord. Oof. Okay. Again, you're going, oh, I want to know more about that. I know, but let's focus back into the goats with that too. Let's show you some sheep passages with this too. So you can kind of flip over with me to 1 Corinthians 3:13 through 18. So here's what it says. Okay. Each one's work will become obvious, for the day will disclose it. Now that means the end now that could actually be the end of their life. That's one way of looking at it. And it also can be the time frame of the separation between the sheep and goats, because it will be revealed in fire. The fire will test the quality of each one's work. If anyone's work he has built survives, he will receive a reward. If anyone's work is burned up, it will be lost, but he will be saved. Yet it will be like an escape through fire. And I don't want to get off it onto too much because it's really kind of interesting. But an escape through fire. These people, these sheep, become believers when Jesus shows up in the clouds at Rosh Hashanah. They become believers, and this is at the end of the tribulation, basically, right? And at the end of the tribulation, they're looking up and they become believers. Now, they have been emaciated at this time frame. They have lost a ton of weight. They're beat up. Most people who have not, and they won't have received the mark of the beast. Really powerful point, because the person that's mark of the beast is going to die by the end of the tribulation. But these people come to Jesus at the very last possible minute. Another analogy you can think of for today is a person who kind of on their deathbed has a salvation experience. That person hasn't built up any wood, precious stone, or silver with that too. And that's where it gets into a little bit deeper. Actually, it says it in verse 11 and 12. No one can lay a foundation other than that has been laid down. That foundation is Jesus Christ. Verse 12. If anyone builds on that foundation gold, silver, costly stones, and then there's a comma, but it actually should have been like a colon. I would have put a colon. Wood, hay, or straw. One's work will become obvious. Okay, so that's one way of looking at that one. They are fireproof. So they're going to go through the fire and they're going to be saved, but just the skin of their teeth with that. The shepherd for peace. Now, this is also used for the remnant, okay? The remnant have a very heavy sheep conversation as well. So the shepherd for peace, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters. Sheep need to be led, need to have shelter, pastures, peace, right? This is what that kind of does. And by the way, the remnant are very much sheep-like in that way too. Let's do John 10, 1 through 16. Now I might skip a little bit in here, okay? Assure you, anyone who doesn't enter the sheep pen by the door but climbs in another way is a thief and a robber. Guys, the thief and robber are the goats, because they try to get into the pen. The one who enters the door is the shepherd of the sheep. Well, that's Jesus. The doorkeeper opens it. The sheep hear his voice, calls his own sheep by his name, and leads them out. When he is brought out all outside, he goes ahead of them. The sheep follow him because they recognize his voice. That's the one key element that they have. And then it goes on until we kind of see this. Verse 9, I am the door. If anyone enters me, he will be saved. He will come in and go out and find pasture. Verse 14, I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and they know me. As the Father knows me, and I know the Father, I lay down my life for the sheep. See, when we become believers, we are sheep. We don't know that much. Those people, when you will see them, you as the bride of Christ, you will see these people, they will have barely any knowledge. 10 days of knowledge. How much knowledge could they have? It's just the basic salvation part, right? So this is the key element with that too. Now, you actually come to Jesus. When you first come to Jesus, you're a little like that, okay? We'll talk more about that. Matthew 24. This is another cool one that gives us the same analogy. And again, we're talking about the way that the scriptures talk about this. Then there were two men in the field, one taken and one left. So the one that is taken would be the separation of the sheep and goats. Most people miss this because they see it as a rapture verse. It is not a rapture verse. It never has been. The one that is left is the goat. I mean, is the sheep. So we're talking about the separation of sheep and goat. Here's another reference to the nations or the sheep in this particular one. So Revelation 19, verse 15. A sharp sword came from his mouth so that he might strike the nations with it. He will shepherd them with an iron scepter. He will also trample the winepress of the fierce wrath or anger of God, the Almighty. Again, he's using nations. No, he definitely we talk about remnant. Remnant is dealt with, and they come to Christ. And there's a very many passages we talked about before on the remnant. But now we're talking about the sheep, which are the nations. And in the Greek word, nations is ethnos. It's outside of the Jews. So you're talking about a Gentile group of people. Okay? Ethnos is a multitude of different people. And so he's shepherding them. Now, I've talked to people who are post-trib in their viewpoint or pre-wrath. So everyone has to go all the way through the tribulation. Let me pull this off the screen for just a half sec. And they say, well, everyone has to go all the way through the tribulation. And I had a guy who had a long and very respectful Facebook conversation with me. And this guy was like on Messenger, and it went over like about 3 or 4 weeks. And he would hit it up. Now, he had written a book. He'd read my book, and he kind of had a nice review of it. And then I read his book, and I was trying to do a nice review of it. And we started getting into this reportee. And back and forth. And he was like, and he would ask me a question, and I would answer it, and ask me a question. Well, this guy knows his end time stuff pretty darn well. But he realizes I know it a little bit better than him. And one of the things that I'm trying to do with him, I'm not trying to put myself ahead of him, but I'm just saying I knew those verses. And I said, one of the problems that happens if you just have a post-trib rapture viewpoint is that at Rosh Hashanah, or several weeks before the end of the tribulation, because we're not appointed for wrath, they will say, well, the rapture happens at that one point in time. And then they come back down with Christ to rule and reign with Christ. And I said, okay, great. So who goes into the millennial reign? And these people have no answer. If you just believe in a post-trib rapture, they have zero answers. And they talk about that in Rapture, Could There Be More Than One? And I go, who goes into the millennial reign? He goes, well, I don't know. Maybe unbelievers, and they become believers. And I'm like, then what's the point of the tribulation? I mean, if you had the tribulation, and Jesus has already seen everyone, so he doesn't have to have 7 years. The point of the tribulation is to push the people to make a decision for or against Jesus. That's it. If you miss the point, if you don't see it that way, because people who have the mark are going to have wrath poured out against them. People who don't have the mark and just die in the tribulation, well, they're already at risk. People who don't have the mark and they are believers can easily die in that time. That's a consequence of living in a very evil time frame with that. Okay? But he could not have an answer of this one, of this, like, it was like, well, then they become believers in the time frame. No, you can't do that. You don't get to like change the rules up with this way. Okay? And so that's why we have to have a group of people who become believers after the third rapture, or the last rapture point. They have to become believers. And I'll show you how this actually works a little bit more. Oops, I clicked on the wrong area. Then we have the survivor nations. Now, this is one of the coolest ones that you'll see in Zechariah 14. So it's the last chapter of Zechariah. And it says, then all the survivors from the nations that came against Jerusalem will go up year by year. So these are people that that were not for Jesus or not for the remnant Jews, because he's talking about remnant Jews. But then he says, okay, then all the survivors. Survivors is the people, are the nations. Those are the sheep. Uses some of the same type of words. It says goy. And goy is a Gentile, a troop of animals. Interesting. Same kind of concepting that has. They will worship year after year they will go up year after year to worship the King, Lord of hosts, and to celebrate the feast of the festival of booths. Now that is the last of the harvest of this, or excuse me, of the 7 different festivals of God. The first 4 happen in the first coming of Christ. The last 3 will happen in the second coming. But the first two of them is Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And those happen at the end of the tribulation. But the Feast of Booths, or the Feast of Tabernacles, is when they get together and they actually tell their stories of one another. And this is actually how we were looking at the foretold book. So we'll give you a real interesting picture of that Feast of Tabernacles, or the Feast of Booths. Should any of the families of the earth not go up to Jerusalem to worship the King of Kings, rain will not fall on them. And then he says, he says, so anyone, okay? And if the people of Egypt will not go up and enter, the rain will not fall on them. This will be the plague the Lord inflicts on the nations who do not go up for the festival to celebrate the Feast of Booths. So he's talking, and he says, he even goes further, this will be the punishment against Egypt and all the nations that do not go up to the celebration. It's a real big charge, but it's giving you an idea of a group of people that have to be in the millennial reign. There's 2 people that are 2 different types of people: the remnant and the nations. The remnant will be over the feasts. They will be over the millennial reign temple. They will be over. That is their job. They're taking up they're the new Jews, and they're the top of the stack in essence. The nations are the survivors, and that's how you have to look at this. This is when you catch what Scripture's saying, you start understanding. You understand the who, but it will tell you when more when you look at it that way. So let's talk a little bit about some sheep nations and some of the differences. The remnant are like the sheep because they believe late. So they both believe at the same time frame at Rosh Hashanah, when Jesus is showing up in the clouds. Again, in the millennial reign, what Abraham's descendants, those are the remnant. That's what he's talking about, and that's in Hebrews 11 in the Hall of Faith when it talks about Abraham. He's talking about the sands will be like, the people will be like, your descendants will be like the sand on the seashore. You're talking about billions of people. So that's really the remnant. Again, survival until the millennial reign needs a salvation before the end. You have to have that, and we talked about that as well. The nations are described in the Old Testament, and the New Testament, though, uses a slightly different term and calls them the sheep, and there's a separation in the sheep and goats. So there has to be another group that comes up to Jerusalem. That's why, guys. I'm just trying to like nail it down with that too. Now, Jesus is the lion that lays down with the lamb. I know we think of this as just only animals. I mean, it says the lion will lay by the lamb. And the answer is the lamb this is more of an analogy than just actual, fact point with that too. It doesn't mean that it's not fact. It's more of an analogy. So I want to show you a biblical equation. I want you just to see as we walk through this. So when you become a believer, you become a child. Understand, child, a little kid of God. You move forward because you do it because the faith of the Father through the blood of Jesus. So your first point, you're using the through port of Jesus, and you're having interactions with the Father. Now, you can't have actual interactions with the Father until you go through Jesus with that too. Okay? So when you're a child, children have interactions with fathers. Now that's why you see all these. Every time it uses a father reference, it's going to talk about the Father God, who writes the laws. Okay, and yet it also inferences children. Okay, now as you grow up, though, you got to grow up. And you grow up and you have more comfort in knowing, and that's the comfort. That's the you're as that first part of it, you are the child or the sheep. And you just heard the voice of Jesus. And so what happens to you is that you grow and you have more comfort in what he's doing in your life. Okay? So then it transitions a little bit into what we call the church. So pretty darn soon after, you become part of the church. Now, I'm going to show you something in a little bit, but there is an exit point that can happen. We'll come to that one in a little bit. Now, the next phase is for you to understand your destiny. Now, some people think that you got to be purified. You are purified in Jesus right here when you're a child. There's nothing you can do to purify yourself. What you need to understand in that growth phase and inside maybe hopefully the church or under good discipleship teaching is that you are betrothed. Betrothed is a child who begins to grow up and she starts to see herself as an adult or a woman. Okay? But yeah, I know men kind of go, oh, I don't like the woman analogy. Guess what? Just grow up. That's all I want you to do. I'm not saying it in a rude way. I'm just saying you got to understand you're growing up. Okay? And your next phase is you start understanding that betrothal is a promise of God. And so what happens, promises are faith points. You're looking forward to those promises happening in life. You see, a child just can't deal with promises. I mean, you can't you have to be really careful with kids and telling them promises because they get really jilted by those promises. But only an adult can understand what promises are, that they not necessarily means today in this moment, but they mean for something in the future. And once you start to see that, your promise is of Jesus as the groom. And then you become that bride, that co-inheritance. Now, this is all these points of marriage happens. Now, when you become the bride, the co-inheritance. Now, the bride and the wedding, we will talk about later in the last one in the friends. But in that wedding thing, you will have that ceremony with God that happens in Revelation 4 and 5, where we have that wedding. The gifts are the crowns, okay? And how you cast your crowns before Jesus on the throne saying, I'm not worthy for that thing. But guess what? Husband and wife are supposed to do something called children, have kids. What are the kids? See, if you do it in the correct way, your children are the sheep. So you become an adult, a child, and you move into your adulthood. You become the bride of Christ, and your children, who you're ruling and reigning with. When we come back to the planet, we got to rule and reign over whom? The child. Now, we're not pushing them down like smashing on them, okay? We're going to be here coming back with these broken individuals. And if you look at the thumbnail that I put out there on this thing, you'll see it. They're very broken. These people are so beat up. I want you to see them as like Holocaust victims. That's exactly what they're going to look like. And so you see that kind of process with that. My father-in-law, as he passed away, he was a skeleton of that. He was a skeleton in his spirit, but because his body was wasting away. And when people do, I see lots and lots of patients of mine who come into my clinic, and I see them either losing weight, and they have a gauntness with that too. And sometimes they just turn off eating with this too. Or that, and you just kind of see there, I call it a decoupling. I mean, it's their brain pulling away from the processes of the body. But again, those are sometimes we see people who are children and then they go to the church and they exit. Now, the exit part that is real big is the goats. Those are people, and we'll talk about those next week because those are one of my most favorite ones to talk about. Or some people will just stay a child and they really don't move forward into that understanding. And maybe they really haven't had a salvation experience, or maybe they're. Here's the thing: it's hard to know. I think they wander, and that's why we talk about them as sheep. So they're wandering away. You see, Jesus uses these analogies. If you had 100 sheep and you found that one of them wandered away, the shepherd would go after him and bring him back and have a celebration. Holy cow, guys! That wandered away sheep is the sheep nations. The sheep aren't sticking in, for instance, the church here. They wander away from the church. Wow. Wow. Again, you don't have to be better than the child. You just have to grow, and you grow by that's where Paul talks about eating the meat, drinking, getting off the milk and eating the meat. When I was a child, I did childish things. But when I was a man, I put away childish things. That's what he's talking about, guys. And you have to see it that way. So as we finish up here with the sheep, I hope you finally kind of catch a glimpse. Maybe you are a sheep right now. Come into the power of God. Come into the understanding of the word, because the word is true. And I've seen so many people in the truther movement who are and these patriots, great people, but you've wandered away from the word. You've wandered away from God, and you don't really know why. But you've kind of wandered into some bad teaching. And I would say, if you've wandered into that bad teaching, realize what I'm trying to help you with and come back to Jesus. Because Jesus is inside of these scriptures. There aren't 777 books of the idiot part of that thing they call it the Bible. That's not the Bible. We have the 66 books of the Bible, and they're here, and I can prove it over and over again. And I just did a couple of them with you. They're showing things that couldn't have existed, and it keeps coming up and proving them over and over again. Trust in Him. And that's why I wrote these books. The reason why I wrote the books, so you could get help to understand who you are. Now, you also might know family members or a husband or wife that is just like a sheep, and you have become the bride, and you become a little bit unequally yoked in some ways, right? It's a very difficult place to live in. And I'm praying for you right now, that I'm praying for the peace of God, and that person will come to inside of the Great Awakening in this post-Nasara time frame, that they become the bride of Christ, because that's the next focus. After all the EBS and Nasara thing, that's the focus, is then we want to see people come in that bride of Christ with that. Hope it helps. If you like it, if you like what we did, push like, subscribe, share it with your friends. And you can always go on to drscottyoung.com and see all the correct social media sites. Thanks so much.